So since I introduced Professor Maharaj first, let me ask him the first question. Professor Brij Maharaj, what are the implications of COVID-19 for refugees and undocumented migrants? In India, particularly, we have been very pained to see the kind of migrant situation where people were displaced from their homes and they walked for miles on end. And if media report is to be believed, some people are walking even today, and it is an entire month from the time that the lockdown happened. What is the situation like in your country? And if possible, could you also comment on the Indian situation, sir? Professor Maharaj.
Thank you, Nandini, and greetings to all the colleagues and friends. I think I know most people who are listening, and thanks to Sada and the team for setting this up. And I need to say that I was present at the JNU Dhaba, Sada, about 10 or 12 years ago, when a group of us met and we formed this committee and group that has grown by leaps and bounds. And there are so many students. I think what's the most empowering part of GRFDT is that there are so many students who are now, senior lecturers and associate professors, and they've been empowered. So this is a great achievement. Listen, we live in uncertain times, total lack of predictability, etc. And there's lots of fear and anxiety about the unknown. Who's carrying this disease? Who's transmitting it? There's an exponential transmission, and the economic consequences. We can talk about airlines being shut down and big corporates losing profits on the stock market. But what happens to the poor people, the disadvantaged, the marginalized? You mentioned, Nandini, in India, my understanding is the lockdown, you had a 4-hour warning. And there was no consideration given to what's going to happen to poor people. The poor people are part of the precarious economy. They are on they live from a day-to-day basis, a subsistence basis, and there was no consideration about what happens to them. And the first response was, let me go home, meaning go back to the village. But the transport was shut down. The buses were shut down. The railways were shut down. They started walking. And there are some horrendous stories in the media, and I think they are factual. So in my country, we had a lockdown. We had some lead time. I think there was a national state of disaster proclaimed on the 15th of March. And we went on to lockdown, if I recall correctly, on the 27th of March. This is our 35th day. So from the 1st of May, we are beginning to open up a bit, so you could walk outside your house a little bit, and certain sectors of the economy are going to be opening up. But universities and schools are still on total shutdown. Now, we are told that you need to wash your hands, etc. And this is one way of stopping the disease, etc. So in my country, poor people are given soap, but they don't have water. And what has happened in South Africa in the past 25 years, we've had, the euphoria of post-apartheid democracy, but simultaneously we had very high levels of corruption and looting. And that meant money that was designed for the poor went in the pockets of the rich. And since this is a diaspora context, some of you would have heard of the famous Gupta family from Saharanpur, who's literally taken trillions of rands out of South Africa, and I assume now they are locked down somewhere in Dubai. We hope they get locked up at some stage. So corruption meant there's less or very little for the poor, and so the race class divisions gets exposed. And one thing about COVID, it cuts across race, class, caste, tribe, gender, sexual orientation. And we've seen, very wealthy people being affected, politicians, the British Prime Minister got infected, etc. So COVID knows no boundaries. I think that's a very important point.
I'll just interrupt for a minute. Everyone, please switch off. Please mute yourselves, please. we are
I
not
think they
able
must
to
put the
hear
mute.
Professor
They got
Maharaj
to
very
mute.
well.
If they mute, then we won't hear them.
No, everyone else, please mute yourself, barring Professor. Yes, please continue, sir.
So we were talking about what happens to the poor people. There's another layer to this, and I was talking about corruption, sorry. So now we have food parcels, etc., being organized by the state. There's various forms of assistance for poor people, for people who depend on the informal sector, etc. Yeah, there's someone's got the radio or something on.
I on mute now, no problem. Somebody was
Okay.
live on mute.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go back a bit. So what we find, and in India, this is a familiar story. So you find that the politicians are coming in, first of all, actually stealing food that's meant for the poor. Then they're using food as a form of political patronage, etc. And in the past 5 weeks of lockdown, 902 schools have been vandalized. And that's quite serious because we have public schools, private schools, and township schools and rural schools. There's a horrific story about the fact that there's a deliberate strategy to damage the schools so that people get tenders. We call them tenderpreneurs. So they get public tenders to go and rebuild and repair the schools from public money. And that's, it's part of how people benefit from disasters, etc. And I know in India, they say about the floods, every time you have your monsoons, the same bridges go down because the same contractors will come back and do partial patchwork so that it will collapse. Now, to connect it with migration and refugees, one of our big problems in South Africa is xenophobia. And it's a strange thing. You can come from the United States or UK and be an undocumented migrant and you'll be celebrated. But if you come from Africa, you're in trouble, and we have some migrants who come from Southeast Asia as well. So there's no healthcare services for them. There's no facilities, and they don't qualify for social grants. They don't qualify for food parcels. So they come under huge pressure, and we can never give the exact number, but the rough estimate says that between 3 to 4 million undocumented migrants in South Africa. A proportion of that come under what is called the refugees, but they're still waiting to get refugee status. It's quite a battle to get refugee status. So the big issue, not only in South Africa, now globally, is what happens to refugees and migrants, because each country is worried about their own. And I know someone in the panel is going to speak about what's happening in the Gulf states, etc. What happens to the Indian laborers, the laborers from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka? They have really built up. If you're seeing the buildings in Dubai and so on, they built on very cheap Asian labor, and some of these people are literally marooned. They don't show what to do. And then the last point I want to make is, what does social distancing mean for poor people? Poor people live in shacks. What does social distancing mean for in a place like Dharbi? How far will you stay from each other, etc.? So I think the concepts and solutions that are being looked at is from a very elite middle class position, totally disconnected from the realities of the poor. And the last point I'll make, in my country, for the first time, the government was listening to the scientists and researchers. So we have the leader of the government COVID crisis response team from the medical side is Professor Sarim Abdul Karim. Like me, he's a person of Indian descent. And normally, because there's a form of anti-Indian discourse emerging, and I've spoken at some of the conferences in India about this, it's very rare for a person of Indian descent to be given a chance to head such a team. But he's literally the best, one of the leading epidemiologists in the world. And he's doing an excellent job. He's become a household name in the past 2 weeks. And I think when the government listens to researchers and evidence and makes decisions based on those social realities versus political ideology, or narrow ethnic agendas, then I think it augurs well for us. So those are my opening remarks, Nandini. I'm happy to obviously expand as we go along.
Thank you so much, Professor Maharaj. Yeah, I completely agree with you. But of course, we will take this up further as we go along.